when I looked at the script and I got really intense and I hit the script. I thought, I can't do this. I don't know how to do this. Wow. And Ron put his arm around me. He's 10 years younger than I am. And said, they're really trying, the writers, as hard as they can. I don't think it's a great idea to hit the script. I said, Ron, I'll never hit the script again.
Henry Winkler recently used those words to describe Ron Howard, but the bond he meant had survived an imbalance neither man expected. Happy Days had been built around Howard. Then Fonzie became the phenomenon. Executives considered putting his name in the title, and Ron was prepared to walk away. For decades, the public version remained reassuringly simple. The two men stayed friends. What Winkler has now clarified is more complicated. Their friendship was tested by a success that elevated Henry while quietly costing Ron, and by the choice Henry made when Hollywood offered him the chance to take even more. That choice can only be understood by looking at the insecurity Henry carried into the role. Born in Manhattan, New York in 1945, Henry Franklin Winkler grew up in a German immigrant family that placed great importance on education and achievement. Yet long before he knew dyslexia had a name, he struggled to read and repeatedly fell short of what his parents expected from him. They interpreted the problem as laziness, and the criticism left him with a lasting fear that approval could disappear whenever he failed. Even after earning a master's degree from the Yale School of Drama, auditions and cold readings remained difficult. Scripts demanded more preparation than most people around him realized. Henry learned to listen closely, improvise when necessary, and respond to the person standing in front of him, rather than depending entirely on memorized words. Those habits would later shape Fonzie, but in 1973, they were simply the tools of an unknown actor who had just arrived in Los Angeles and needed work. During his second week in town, Winkler auditioned for a small role in a nostalgic television comedy. The character had only a handful of lines and was never intended to dominate the series. Henry returned in costume, lowered his voice, changed the way he carried himself, and won the part around his 28th birthday. The show was Happy Days, and the young actor already established at its center was Ron Howard. Ron had spent much of his life on camera. He had been Opie on The Andy Griffith Show, worked in movies, and understood marks, lenses, and production schedules almost instinctively. Henry came from theater and formal training, yet he was the newcomer on a television set. Their relationship began as an exchange. Ron helped Henry understand the camera, while Henry brought a looser instinct shaped by stage work and improvisation.
We became great acting partners and then great friends, and he was really like, and is kind of like a big brother to me, and we always had that.
They soon developed a rhythm neither man had to explain. If Henry shifted the timing of a line, Ron adjusted. If Ron changed the emotional temperature of a scene, Henry followed. Howard later summarized it simply: "We just clicked as acting partners." Winkler described an invisible connection between them, something that existed during Happy Days and continued outside it. The chemistry looked effortless, although part of it grew from trust built around Henry's reading difficulties. When he lost a line or missed a cue, the cast did not humiliate him. Ron's steadiness gave him room to recover. That trust became visible when the series abandoned its original single-camera format and began filming before a live studio audience. Winkler had theater experience and welcomed the change. Howard, despite working in television since childhood, had never been trained to perform in front of a crowd. Before one of the first live tapings in 1975, cast members later recalled finding Ron shaking in a wardrobe closet. Henry later put it bluntly, Ron Howard was almost vomiting. Once the cameras rolled, Howard performed with such control that the audience could not see any of it. The detail became more significant with time because the crowd Ron initially feared soon became the force that changed the balance of the show. Its loudest and longest reactions increasingly belonged to Henry. Fonzie's entrances began drawing cheers that delayed scenes. Fan mail and publicity shifted toward Winkler. Children copied the thumbs-up gesture. Strangers crowded around him, and a character hired for a limited purpose became the face of a series designed around someone else. For Henry, the attention was intoxicating and frightening at once. He had spent his early life being told he was not good enough, and now audiences were treating him as if he could do no wrong. The success also created a problem no amount of chemistry could erase.
Live in the family, and that's why I'm successful. I'm asking you, if you never listen to me again, leave it alone.
Ron was still the lead, yet the network and studio wanted more of the character who caused the biggest reaction. By the end of the second season, executives were considering a title that would make the transfer official: Fonzie's Happy Days. For Howard, this was no longer simply a question of which actor received the biggest laugh. Accepting the new title would mean publicly agreeing that he had become secondary in his own show. He told the executives that if they made the change, he would rather return to USC and film school. He was prepared to leave. Henry was the person who stood to gain the most. The new title would have turned his unexpected popularity into formal ownership of the series. Instead, he refused to support it. Winkler believed changing the title would insult the ensemble that had helped make Fonzie successful. Gary Marshall also rejected the proposal, and Happy Days kept its name. The decision did not return every piece of attention Ron had lost, nor did it remove the discomfort created by the network's behavior. It did establish one boundary. Henry would accept the success, but he would not use it to publicly remove Ron from the story. That boundary mattered because Henry could not control the audience. He could reject a title, but he could not stop viewers from cheering longer for Fonzie, or executives from shifting material toward him. The more professionally generous he tried to be, the more complicated the situation became. Ron could see that Henry was not campaigning against him, yet he still had to live with the consequences of Henry's rise. The friendship survived, partly because it was not confined to a set. Ron and his wife Cheryl chose Henry and his wife Stacy as godparents to their daughter, Bryce Dallas Howard. Their families spent time together beyond publicity events, and Bryce later described the Winklers as another set of parents within Hollywood. This was not a relationship maintained only for reunion photographs. Their children grew up inside it. A small object on the Happy Days set quietly recorded that connection. Outside the doors of Arnold's Drive-In stood a narrow shelf where Henry and Ron placed coffee or water before entering a scene. Henry began writing on it, marking events from the series and collecting signatures from Howard, Marshall, and Marion Ross. When Cheryl was expecting Bryce, he recorded it. When Stacy was expecting Zoe, he added that too. The shelf was becoming a private timeline inside a public television set. The show reached the top of the ratings, but Howard never hid that directing was his larger ambition. He had already directed Grand Theft Auto in 1977 and kept searching for a way to build a second career. By 1980, remaining on Happy Days would have meant postponing that goal. Before the decision became public, he called Henry at work. There was a phone booth near the entrance to stage 19. Someone told Winkler that the call was for him.
Right. And he goes, "Oh my God, we're going to die. How are we getting out of here? This is amazing."
Ron was on the line, and he wanted Henry to hear the news before it appeared in the press. He was not returning to the show. Henry's first response was not anger at Ron. It was fear. The acting partner, who understood his timing almost instinctively, was leaving, and Henry believed his own working life might collapse with him. Fonzie had been built through reaction as much as performance. Ron was the person who could follow a shift without explanation, and now that person was about to disappear from the set. Winkler later remembered the thought in 4 words: "My life is over." For several moments he said nothing. The reaction revealed how much of Fonzie's apparent confidence had depended on a partnership the audience could not see. Then Henry told Ron to go. Directing had been Howard's dream throughout the 7 years they had worked together, and Henry refused to ask him to abandon it simply because the departure frightened him. He encouraged Ron to pursue the career he wanted and become the best director he could be. Happy Days continued, and Henry stayed through the end of its 11-season run. But the person who had helped shape his most important work was no longer beside him. The meaning of that phone call remained incomplete for decades. Henry knew what he had felt, but he did not know what his response had meant to Ron. Howard would later tell him that the encouragement confirmed he was making the right decision. Until that later conversation, Winkler had carried the memory mainly as a moment of loss. A few years after the call, the imbalance between them returned in reverse. On Happy Days, Henry's popularity had placed Ron's position at risk. Now, Ron was trying to establish himself as a studio film director, and the opportunity depended on the very name that had once eclipsed him. Warner Brothers was willing to finance Night Shift if Henry Winkler agreed to star. Howard gave him the script and offered him either of the 2 leading roles. Henry accepted quickly, then chose the quieter, anxious character rather than the flashy role most viewers would have expected the Fonz to take. His agreement did more than reunite 2 former co-stars. It helped get the movie made and gave Howard the studio opportunity he needed. The film also began Ron's long creative partnership with producer Brian Grazer, an alliance that eventually grew into Imagine Entertainment. Henry's name had opened the door through which Howard's directing career advanced. Ron could have treated Winkler's fame as the symbol of what he had lost on Happy Days. Instead, he built his next opportunity around it. Henry, in turn, used the same fame that had complicated their friendship to help Ron move forward. The success that once threatened to divide them became the thing one entrusted to the other. That decision also gave Henry a chance to move away from Fonzie. He deliberately chose a restrained, nervous man whose energy ran in the opposite direction from the character that had made him famous. Yet leaving the leather jacket behind for one movie did not solve the larger problem. When Happy Days ended in 1984, the industry still struggled to imagine Henry as anyone else. Fonzie had brought him international recognition, financial security, and affection from strangers. Henry never dismissed those gifts. The role had also become a wall. The same specificity that made him impossible to ignore now made other versions of him difficult to see. Winkler later said, "He went dark. For years, acting opportunities became scarce, and he wondered whether he would ever do anything as powerful as Fonzie again." Ron had left the series to pursue the future he wanted. Henry stayed until the end and discovered that the character he had perfected was blocking the road forward. The setback touched the insecurity that predated fame. He had spent his childhood fearing that one weakness could define him, and now one success was defining him just as completely. The public loved Henry because of Fonzie, while the profession often seemed unable to separate the actor from the image. Approval had not disappeared, but it had become a cage shaped like a leather jacket. His lawyer encouraged him to begin producing a job Henry initially knew little about. Winkler resisted, before accepting that he could learn. The move led to MacGyver and gave him a way to remain creative when casting directors would not offer the range he wanted. Producing restored his career before it restored his confidence as an actor. The work required a different discipline from performing. Henry found himself editing episodes late into the weekend so they could reach the network on schedule. There was no entrance applause and no familiar gesture to rescue him. He had to make decisions, solve problems, and build something that did not depend on Fonzie's popularity. The experience gave him control at a time when acting had left him powerless. Learning that he was dyslexic also changed the meaning of his past. The diagnosis came after his stepson faced similar difficulties, giving Henry a name for the struggle his parents had misunderstood. He later helped create the Hank Zipzer books for children who felt confused or ashamed by school. The man who once feared the written page became an author by turning that fear into a language other children could recognize. Acting returned gradually, not through one miraculous comeback, but through roles willing to puncture the invincible image of the Fonz. Each opportunity tested whether audiences could accept Henry as anxious, foolish, vain, or vulnerable. The process was slow because reinvention required more than removing the jacket. It required persuading an industry that the jacket had never contained the whole man. In 2003, Arrested Development brought him into Ron Howard's professional world again. Winkler expected to appear in only a small number of episodes as the Bluth family's incompetent attorney, Barry Zuckerkorn. The role expanded and continued for years, while Howard served as executive producer and narrator. The reunion did not erase the difficult period after Happy Days. It did offer quiet evidence that Ron still saw an actor where much of Hollywood had continued to see Fonzie. Howard was no longer the young lead being overshadowed by Henry's popularity. He was an established filmmaker inviting Henry into a comedy shaped by his own creative authority. Henry's later work on Barry finally dismantled the old assumption on a larger scale. As Gene Cousineau, he played a teacher whose vanity, insecurity, and need for recognition were exposed rather than hidden beneath coolness. In 2018, he won his first Primetime Emmy more than 4 decades after Fonzie made him famous. The award mattered because it proved that Henry had eventually found a way to stand beside the character without being swallowed by him. His 2024 Emmy reunion with Howard offered the image audiences expected. On a recreation of Arnold's Drive-In, Ron prompted Henry toward the jukebox. Winkler struck it in the familiar way, and the Happy Days theme began to play. It was warm, recognizable, and safely nostalgic, with no sign of the discomfort that had once existed beneath the series' success. The more revealing conversation came later, when Henry and Ron recorded a discussion with their daughters Zoe Winkler and Bryce Dallas Howard. The two families had remained close for decades, and Henry was Bryce's godfather. Yet one subject had almost never been discussed directly. Ron finally acknowledged that the rise of Fonzie had hurt his feelings. He had begun Happy Days as its clear lead, then watched executives and network officials change the way they treated him as Henry became the greater attraction. The admission did not describe a feud. It described the wound created when a professional arrangement changed around him without his consent. Howard also made an equally important distinction. He wasn't trying to make anybody feel badly, Ron said. Henry was doing good work, and that work was helping the show. Winkler said it was the only time they had truly discussed the issue. That admission changed the meaning of their long silence. Ron had not been untouched by what happened, and Henry had not been unaware of the imbalance. Their friendship lasted because neither man required the other to lie about it. Ron could admit that the experience hurt without treating Henry as the person who caused the wound. Henry could accept how much he benefited without pretending the success had been harmless. Howard also told Henry what the telephone conversation at stage 19 had meant to him. After Ron announced he was leaving, Henry's encouragement made him feel that pursuing directing was the right decision. Henry had carried his own memory of that call for nearly 50 years without knowing that his response had given Ron the reassurance he needed. That was what Winkler finally clarified after half a century. There had been no hidden romance, secret feud, or dramatic reconciliation. There had been an uncomfortable transfer of stardom, a genuine hurt, and a series of decisions that prevented professional pain from becoming personal betrayal. The title change had been rejected. The phone call had ended with encouragement rather than resentment. Night Shift had turned Henry's fame into Ron's opportunity. Arrested Development later brought Henry back into Ron's creative world. Their friendship survived not because the difficult parts were imaginary, but because neither man used them as a weapon. During the conversation with their daughters, Henry brought up the narrow shelf that had once stood outside Arnold's doors. He and Ron had placed their drinks on it before entering scenes. Over the years, Henry wrote down events from the production and collected signatures from Ron, Gary Marshall, and Marion Ross. He also marked the pregnancies that brought Bryce and Zoe into their families. When Happy Days ended, Henry took the shelf home. Ron's signature is still there, beside the handwritten record of the daughters who eventually sat with them and heard the story completed.